This is the first in a series of 4 that are being sponsored by Redington, and Redington is the talent partner distributor for Middle East Africa. And the objective here is really just to start looking at data and data management opportunities that exist within the Middle East Africa region. So the presentation here is very much customized on what we're seeing both within the industry and also how we're seeing the adoption of data and data management projects cascade throughout the region itself. So we've got an hour to cover. There's a Q&A session, I think, that's scheduled at the end, but obviously if somebody wants to raise a flag as we go through the presentation, then please feel free to do that. So I'm just going to start off. The actual presentation itself isn't technical. It's not product specific. So what we're trying to do is to give an industry view of where we see the challenges and the opportunities of data and data management. So if I start off on the first slide. Right, let me just try it again. Okay, so hopefully we're looking at a screen that says modern data management concepts and data, and it's all about ones and zeros. I don't know if anyone can confirm that's what you guys are seeing. So if I just move on from there, so the interesting thing, here is that data has changed a lot. It's changed a lot primarily because the industry is moving more and more towards digitalization. And the main concept behind digitalization is that effectively data is just a series of ones and zeros. So it goes back to the old engineering concepts of binary. But the interesting thing again is that it's not always about ones and zeros. So when we look at data, we have to put data into a context here. And when we talk about data, there's effectively structured data and unstructured data. And I'll touch on this a little bit more when we get into the detail of the presentation itself. But think of data not only in terms of a database or a data warehouse. Think of data not just in terms of customer information or supplier information, but think of data as video, as IoT, it can be voice, because ultimately what digitalization is doing is distilling any data down to the basics, and the basics are just ones and zeros. Now, that's significant because if we look at it historically, data and data management 5 years ago was very traditional, and it was very much based primarily on structured data. So data that organizations have, be it financial data, customer data, etc., etc. But the real value of data that we're seeing, and where organizations can actually extract value from data, is coming more and more from unstructured data, and that can be something like social media, and as I mentioned before, it can be a video feed, it can be an audio feed, it can be anything that you want it to be. So the challenge for organizations today, and we hear a lot of talk about the increase in volumes of data, and the increase in volumes of data is happening not just at a global level, but also at an organizational level. So as organizations become more mature and organizations start to adopt data on a much more generic basis, and that data is existing more and more external to their organization, then this whole concept and idea of just treating data in its basic format, which is ones and zeros, suddenly becomes more important and also more accessible. So if we now start to look at the concept of data management. So data management is really around how do you manage the types of data, the volumes of data, how do you manage data that is static, data that's in transit, etc., etc. This is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge for all organizations right the way across the region. And this can be from government organization, it can be from federal government, it can be from local government, from municipalities, to telco operators, to banking organizations, and everyone is affected the same. So data as a challenge is something that you can see in any organization that you want to talk to. But data management at one point was very stable. So if we look at it from a data warehousing business intelligence perspective, it hasn't changed much since the mainframe days. But now technology change is turning this whole thing upside down. So the concept of big data is not new. We could look at real-time big data, we could look at data lakes, data warehouses, etc., etc. But certainly, again, looking at Middle East Africa, the access to technology that will enable data to be connected and data to be analyzed is really being driven by the technology and the connections that you have. And essentially, it really is sort of down to cloud computing that's driving the adoption of change, and it's making organizations think much broader than the siloed data centers, machine rooms, etc., that most of your customers have today. Now, there's obviously limitations, and we see limitations around data sovereignty, and this is happening almost right the way across Middle East and Africa. But the thing that's changing that now is that with the investment by people such as AWS, Azure, to a degree Google, although we don't see a lot of investment by Google in the region, and other less known cloud providers such as Alibaba. What we're seeing now is that as this technology becomes more accessible, and as the world is becoming much more competitive, and as data becomes not just the new oil or the new gold of value, then in essence you have to be in a situation where customers at some point can build new competencies, and those new competencies around data have to be beyond their current compute environment, and it has to be to a point where they have the agile infrastructure to be able to apply new concepts and new ideas. And I mentioned before, it could be IoT, it can be video, it can be voice, etc., etc. But as this data becomes high velocity, as the data becomes real time, then to extract value from data effectively requires the implementation of machine learning and, to a degree, artificial intelligence. So the good thing is that from a reseller, from a system integrator perspective, this is an area that's very interesting to all of your customers. It's an area that's very challenging. And certainly it's an area where even if they have maturity today, and if I look at banking as a good example, core banking is a very structured and disciplined environment. But when you apply the rules of data management to digital banking, to new startup banks, etc., then the environment that you have and the skills and the potential for developing new services suddenly becomes much more time driven. And certainly for, again, looking at banking, you've got the requirement of both compliance, but you have to shorten your time to market. And certainly you have to be in a position where you're bringing new services to market, because the environment is getting very competitive. And particularly in banking, because the challenge, the competition isn't really around the other banks. A lot of the competition is actually coming from the IT vendors themselves. So we can certainly see AWS already today. They compete with Amazon, with retailers, but we can see them increasing more and more their wallet share of financial services. We can see it with Apple that have their Apple Pay type applications. And that's not even including the fintech startups and the organizations that are really challenging traditional banking in terms of trying to grow their business and grow their revenues. So digitalization is something that's happening everywhere. Very few companies in Middle East Africa have a digital strategy from our experience. And we're only just starting to see the emergence of chief digital officers or chief data officers becoming part of the customer's management hierarchy. And behind that is really, it's an indication of how mature those organizations are and what the opportunities are for resellers and integrators of IT solutions into fairly traditional and also startup markets. So everyone's involved in management. No person, no role, no job is untouched. And the interesting thing again is that when we look at the investment of organizations into digitalization or data management strategies, more and more now it's coming from the business unit and not from IT themselves. So this presentation is really talking about data management concepts. And if we look at the main factors or the main components of data management, it comes down to data architecture, data flows, data quality management, data modeling, data governance, etc., etc., etc. This is quite a broad requirement and a broad specification. So for this presentation, we're just going to touch essentially on data flows. We'll talk a little bit about data quality and data quality management. We'll talk a little bit about data modeling. We'll talk a little bit about data governance. And finally, we'll touch on data curation and data cataloging. These are the current data management components that effectively are at the IT level, whereas data science and to a degree data visualization tends to be more business orientated. And data architecture, the reason that we're not including it in these concepts is that it has quite a high dependency on cloud, and not for everybody on this call is cloud a viable option, but it's changing. So I'll touch a little bit on data architecture. It's interesting that if we talk with most customers today, when you go out and speak to organizations that you know, most of what they have is built on the foundation of what we call 1990s principles. It's very much relational databases. They may do something around data warehousing. Their ETL is very much based on batch process. And we have issues around data latency in the region, etc., etc. But very few organizations are able, even if they're willing, to address the more recent developments in big data with NoSQL, etc., etc. So the emergence of big data technologies is very sort of patched, and new concepts are sort of drafted onto the surface of old architectures, which means that people have a very sort of patched approach to data management. And the problem is that data management is very much a strategic initiative, but most IT organizations are really focused on tools and point products. And this becomes a problem now. So when we look at the requirement for data warehouses and moving on to data lakes, these have become sort of silos, and the challenges that organizations have, because they don't treat data management and data strategically, is that they're trying to sort of almost join the dots and trying to get the patchwork of different tools and products and infrastructures and trying to convert them into a strategic platform. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, obviously, there are reference architectures, and we're calling out here Lambda architecture, which is very much an environment for big data. But even today, when organizations start to look at new architectures, the industry is moving so rapidly, and we're talking about data management concepts here, but the trend now is towards containerization, and the trend is more and more towards serverless computing. And that can become a dilemma for a lot of your customers, because some people are reluctant to make investments in data management because they believe that there's always something new and better that comes along. But the problem is, if you hold and wait for things to become stable and to become mature, it never really happens. So there's always this balance between when to invest, what to invest, and why to invest. But you have to look at the concepts of data management as being strategic to an organization, and also remember that data is a team sport. So data isn't really the responsibility of IT. IT's responsibility is to provide the infrastructure and the tools for data to be managed, but the responsibility for structured data is very much at the business level. So we're seeing a lot more movement from proof of concepts, where we're talking with customers at the technology level and talking about integration with their databases, their applications, how we can transform that data and push it out to data visualization, to data scientists, etc. But that's shifting now, and we're talking more and more to the business. And it's the business that will actually run proof of values versus proof of concepts. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the value that data can bring to an organization, which can be significant, the investment in a data management platform doesn't have to be a huge investment. And certainly when you look at SaaS type options, where organizations are not having to build and maintain large IT infrastructures, where they can actually gain access to data management platforms through a simple sign in and sign off type approach, then the cost and the investment doesn't have to be massive. But the challenge here is that because IT is much more accessible, and with the availability of cloud infrastructures, the danger is that the business, if they don't get the tools and the technologies that they need from IT, it's more than possible and it's more than feasible that they can go out and procure those and implement those directly. So in the US, they call it shadow IT, where effectively business units are just acquiring, and they can build highly available multi-node cluster environments, primarily with a Visa card or a MasterCard. And you don't have to be a vSphere, Hyper-V expert to be able to build multi-node complex cluster configurations. You can do that with the minimal of data management experience. So there's a word of warning to the IT customers that you have, that if they're not able to deliver the infrastructure that's required for data management, the danger is that the business would just go out and acquire it direct. And this does happen, and it's happening more and more as cloud becomes available and accessible to organizations in Middle East and Africa. A cornerstone of data management is really data quality. And when we look at data quality, again, there's the old world and the new world. So the interesting thing now is that when you're looking at the traditional way that organizations have addressed data quality, and quite often it sort of is limited to data cleansing and almost having teams of people that effectively are changing data. The problem with data is that it never stays constant. So if you look at personal data, people's ages change, their telephone numbers change, their emails change, their addresses change, even their names change, and many other things will change from a customer perspective. So the old approach of trying to cleanse data and maintain data almost becomes unmanageable and certainly isn't effective. So what you have to do is to look at the automation of data quality. And remember, I mentioned before that data quality is really the responsibility of the business and not the responsibility of IT. But when we look at data quality, then when we're talking about integrity, when we're talking about business rules, when we're talking about data rules, these have to be established within a data management hierarchy. And the process of cleansing data, improving that data, has to become more business orientated. And here we start to introduce the concepts of data stewardship and chief data officers, where effectively the responsibility of data management is moving more and more outside of IT. But obviously, when we look at data quality, whatever data the organization is using, whether it's for analytics or whether they're pushing it to CRMs, ERP solutions, etc., the data quality component becomes very important. So when you look at the traditional ETL, ELT process, most organizations are fairly mature on data extraction, transformation and loading. But when you get to big data, then the world changes, because the difference between ELT and ETL is significant, both at a technological level and also at a business process management level. So when we start looking at data quality, then data modeling suddenly becomes very important. It's very significant to an organization, it's very strategic to an organization, but the old, if you like, the data modeling practices that people have used in the past, which is designing structures to store data in relational database, this is being challenged now. And it's being challenged because when you move to big data, and every organization has to move to big data, it's very much a strategic requirement, then the modeling is very different. So the modeling purpose that sort of changes data at the design level is moving from conceptual to logical to physical. With big data, you begin with physical, and you then to try to attempt to reduce or deduce a logical model. So again, from an opportunity perspective, this is something that your customers are having to adapt and evolve towards. But the problem is that if they don't look at this whole concept of data management at a strategic level, there's always the danger that they acquire more point products and they tend to make their IT environment even more complex. And the key thing with data is that data should flow within an organization. Organizations have been very good at collecting static data, but static data doesn't do anything other than sit on a spindle and go round and round and round. Organizations that have access to data, the challenge and the opportunity is to extract value from that data. And this is where the strategic importance of a modern data management platform becomes very, very critical for every organization. And again, if I look at customers we talk to right the way across Middle East, Africa, most of the people we talk to are still struggling with some of the basics, and they're struggling quite often with just simple data integration. And once they master data integration, then the second challenge is to manage data quality. Because if you've got access to more and more data, and as you're starting to make business decisions, if you're starting to create dashboards, if you're starting to define KPIs, integration is always the first step. But it's always a case that if the data quality is wrong, then the reporting becomes wrong. Now, that's sort of okay if you're looking at a business critical type environment where you're looking to forecast or to extrapolate information based on data that you have. But when that process moves away from being business critical to mission critical, where business decisions are being made daily, hourly, by the minute, by the second, based on the data that's available, then it's very important that the quality of that data is correct. Because if it's not just a question of somebody's dashboard isn't accurate or the KPIs are not reflecting reality. It might be that the consequences of getting data quality wrong result in financial loss or financial gain, or businesses making the wrong decisions at the wrong time. And obviously, when you look at the extremes of that, when you're looking at trading, organizations that are doing forex trading, or organizations that are making business decisions, whether to buy or sell commodities, etc., if the data quality is wrong, then the business outcome is wrong, and the impact of the organization is massive. And eventually, if you take the concept of data to the extreme, which effectively is where it becomes life critical, which in a lot of cases data is, and it's not just in the traditional examples of robotic surgery or people doing remote diagnosis on clinical information, etc., etc. It can be down to something as simple as traffic management. It can be down to something as simple as turn-by-turn navigation, because the consequences of getting that wrong is that the vehicles will collide, you'll have road accidents, and effectively that is potentially life-threatening. And you can take that concept to air traffic control, to drone highways. So data is becoming high stakes now. And where data becomes high stakes, then organizations have to look at it again more strategically. And I use the word strategic almost in every sentence that I talk about, because this is the education that you have to have with the customers, that things are changing. And certainly as data becomes more and more strategic, then people have to change this now. Now, the interesting thing is organizations become more dependent, and as business decisions are becoming more data driven. And obviously the more data organizations acquire, and the requirement around security increases, the requirements around confidentiality increase, and certainly looking at the more regulated markets that we see, banking, financial services and insurance is one clear one, healthcare is another. Then organizations have to internally and externally comply with various standards that they will be measured against. That can be something as simple as GDPR. It can be something that relates to PCI compliance or BCBS when you're looking at banking organizations. It can apply to many different regulations, from HIPAA to, as I say, PCI, right the way through to localized requirements, and in South Africa it could be something like POPI. So it's interesting when you look at the requirements of organizations and the maturity of organizations around data management. At some point, data governance will become a key requirement. And again, we're looking at effectively the old world versus the new world. So even if organizations feel today that they have a level of maturity on data governance, then this is under more and more pressure, because as data is becoming more external to the organization, and this is always a key requirement, there's more value to data external to an organization than there is internal. And as people are acquiring more and more data from many different sources, and we're seeing a big increase in data brokerage, where organizations that have created value from data commoditize that data and they sell it on even to competitors on a anonymous basis. But more and more now we're seeing trading and we're seeing business units that are being built up in organizations because the value they create from data they can monetize. So we're seeing a lot more collaboration. But as organizations become more data driven, then the agility, the speed, the self-service, and to a degree being autonomous as an organization is driving more and more the requirements to have data about the data. So when we talk about data governance, we're talking about data lineage, because you need to know where that data has come from. You need to do data audits. You need to look at where the data is in the organization, who owns the data, because as you're making business decisions on the data about the data becomes even more significant. So trying to understand what data sits in the organization, trying to understand when business decisions are being made, what data set has been used, who it's been used by, and when it was used, suddenly become as valuable as the data itself. And this is interesting because in any organization, whether it's a startup organization, whether it's a mature organization, more and more now the requirement for data governance is being driven at a business level and not at an IT level. So what we're seeing is really almost a balance between this requirement for self-service analysis, where people are having to do more in terms of discovery, but quite often it's not compatible with change management process. So there's always an internal dilemma between the business and IT, but data governance is definitely an area that we're seeing more maturity on. We're definitely seeing more demand for data governance solutions, and this is happening at government level, and it's also happening in more traditional organizations such as telcos, healthcare organizations, right the way across the board. The other point I just wanted to talk about was really data curation. So again, and this is a common theme, we can talk about the old traditional ways of organizations managing the data that they have and how data is being moved around the organization itself. But when we talk about data curation, you need to oversee a collection of data assets, and you need to make that data available and discoverable by your data consumers. So data catalog that we touched on earlier is an essential sort of data curation activity, but curating and data catalog have to work together. So for organizations to be able to know where that data has come from, and that can be something as simple as or as basic as crowdsourcing. More and more now organizations are looking at social data and social information to really increase the variety of data that's available to them. But obviously, as you start to look at collaboration, you can look at more domain creation where organizations are having data stewards and businesses that are managing the data that they have and they're responsible for, right the way around to what we call lead curators, where people are having to moderate the data and to manage the data so that there is a structure and a hierarchy around data management within the organization itself. And the last one that's probably more interesting to a lot of people is around data science. And again, this is taking this data that's available in an organization, both internal and external to the organization, and whether it's structured data or unstructured data, and effectively using that data to make decisions or to predict situations by using analytics, and those analytics are moving more and more from sort of predictive analytics to prescriptive analytics to cognitive analytics now. And this really drives the requirement for much more specialized roles within data science. So when we look at the two main areas that Talend is driving and the industry is driving in terms of creating more value and improving the business decisions within the organization, we see it as two areas. It's the predictive, what we call casual analytics. So there's two very good examples here of predictive analytics, and there's also prescriptive analytics. So when we look at predictive, it really is looking at the probability of predicting an outcome from a particular event or the behavior of a person in a certain situation. So if someone is using a credit card, then the predictive analytics will predict what their next spend would be, and typically on what products or what services. When we look at prescriptive, this is more around almost self-learning. So if you look at the example here of self-driving cars, data can be used to train self-driving cars. You can develop and you can apply algorithms to the data to bring more intelligence to it. So when you look at vehicles, this information is being used real time to help the vehicle itself make the decisions. So when to turn, which path to take, when to slow down, when to speed up. So data, and it goes back to what I said before, in the prescriptive analytics, this is where data can become almost life critical, because the consequences of self-driving vehicles are that if you get it wrong, you can end up with very disastrous situations where vehicles can crash, etc., etc. And really the last point is around data visualization. So a lot of the customers that you'll talk to will want to run some nice graphics. They want to understand graphically what this data actually means to the organization. And data visualization is the way of achieving that. So data visualization is essential for when you're looking at large amounts of data. And what it's doing, it's actually creating a very high level overview or summary of the data that the organization has. So a data management platform will collect the data, it will pre-process that data, it will do the cleansing, it will do the integration, it will do the transformation. But once that data has been processed, then the data visualization tools are very much used for helping organizations understand both historic data and also to trend future requirements. They're the main sort of components that we want to look at as far as data management is concerned. But I think hopefully you're starting to get a view now that data can be anything. Data is internal to the organization, data is external to the organization. Data can be structured, it can be unstructured, it can be data about the data. But as organizations become more and more digitally driven, the type of data and the value that they can extract from data almost becomes unlimited. And when we look at organizations that have been successful, the successful organizations are those that have built competencies around data. They have a digital strategy as an organization. And what they're trying to do is to balance the access of technology, but also the demands of the business and the creativity of the business, because everyone's in a competitive environment, even at a government organizational level. You have a duty to collect taxes, you have a duty to provide information to the population, you have a duty to be able to deliver those services to your customers, to people that are taxpayers or people that are tourists or anybody that's using the services of a government organization. because at the end of the day, you have to create value. And when you look at the economic dependence at country level for organizations that are dependent on tourism, for organizations that are dependent on um, resources, for for countries that are dependent on manufacturing or assembly, everything is being driven by digital platforms and digitalization. And certainly with the increase of network performance, fiber is rolled out, you know, almost right the way across Middle East and Africa, then it really is down to individual organizations and countries to look at data, as I say, as a strategic asset, and to put the infrastructure in place and to create an environment where countries or companies or individuals can prosper. And the world is getting smaller. The world is becoming more and more global. And particularly now when there's less travel, people are depending more and more now on online purchases, on online searches, on more collaboration online. And this effectively is driving the requirement for data management solutions. Now, I mentioned before that this isn't new to most, if not all of your customers, but still for a lot of people, not just in Middle East, Africa, but globally, data management is still hard for people to master. So why is this the case? Well, I've mentioned before that too many companies and organizations, they treat data management as a technology issue, and it's not. It's as much a business issue as it is a technology issue. So when we look at how people have approached data management, they've acquired data integration products, they've looked or they've tried to apply data quality rules, and they've tried to create delivery of data to their internal customers or external customers. But quite often the business outcomes are not as expected. And this is just an example of a typical company. This is very US centric. But in a big enterprise organization, people have got more than 400 sources of data. They've probably got 6 different tools, etc., etc. But the key thing is that digital transformation projects fail, and a lot of organizations are failing to extract value from the data that they have as an organization. So they've lacked quality and data governance, maturity. They've become disjointed with projects, shadow IT, where businesses have gone out and acquired their own technology. So these are things that have all sort of led to the failing of a lot of projects, and primarily because data management has not been seen as a strategic requirement. But that's changing, and it's changing because people have to adapt to change today. So if we look at almost a summary now, if we look at the data management concepts, the key thing to remember is that the data types are very important. So data types, we have structured data, we have unstructured data, but it's interesting if you read this slide, more than 80% of the data available to a business now is unstructured. So that can be social networks, it can be IoT devices, it can be video feeds, it can be whatever you want it to be. But the value of the data more and more is moving away from the data that the organization owns and maintains to data that's external to the organization and data that's coming from multiple sources. And the interesting thing is that it's becoming more complex, and the demands at the business level are more than what IT can deliver. So it's very important that when you talk with customers, even mature organizations, most, if not all, of the IT companies lack the infrastructure, they lack the strategic platforms, and they lack the investment in technology because they're trying to approach data management as another band-aid, where they're trying to acquire more tools because they're lacking certain features and functionality. But if those organizations look at data management more strategically, and if they align what they can achieve to the business, then quite often it's the business that will provide the funding for IT to deliver the infrastructure and the services. And we're seeing that right the way across the board. And I mentioned earlier, we're definitely seeing more and more proof of values where the sponsor for IT and IT change is going to be the business unit itself. So when we talk about the components, again, when you look at the past and the future, there's a big difference now. We're seeing more and more a shift away from data marts and data warehouses to data lakes. We're looking more and more about the business requirement of how data is being used and how compliance can be applied at a business level. We're looking more and more at the requirements of data privacy and copyright, because any organization that is storing data, confidential data, is something that is key. And from a Middle East Africa perspective, we're seeing more and more that the IT organizations becoming the data fort, where they're protecting sensitive information. But as we move to more structured data, as we move to more unstructured data, then it doesn't really matter. That data can be shared by anyone because it has no particular value. And quite often that data is just transitioning through the organization. So the only data that a business is going to be interested in, if it's unstructured, is going to be on an exception basis. And that could be something like a video feed where you're looking at facial recognition, or you're looking at traffic management solutions where you're only really interested in data that relates to an out-of-line situation. So most of the data will pass through the organization, the same as IoT. You're really not interested in the green status of the sensor. What you're more interested in is the amber status or the red status, or where something that should be turned on is turned off, or you're seeing a sequence of events that are indicating an issue that needs to be explored. And we're seeing more now that the data formats that in the past were probably limited to Word and Excel are now becoming web-based. We're looking at video, we're looking at executable code, because effectively, again, this is just data that needs to be monitored and managed. And when we look at the tracking of changes within an organization, when we look at building directories, when we're looking at change data capture, these again are components that we're seeing more and more, where organizations are looking at new concepts and new principles. And that leads to data security, data storage, etc., etc. So information management and data management are normally very, very different. If we look at the traditional information management, it's normally around business intelligence, performance management, enterprise data management, content delivery, etc., etc. Data management is more around the data governance, the data quality, the master data management, metadata. These are the components of modern data management platforms, which are different to the traditional information management platforms. So I've touched on this before, but the key thing is, who owns the data, and the data is very much owned by the business, and a data management platform effectively will give both IT and the internal users the access to the products that they have for data management and data quality control. And the other key thing is around data management systems. You have to look at a much broader picture. We have to look at the requirements of external users, people that are having external access. It might be through online shopping, it might be through online browsing, it could be anything that you want it to be. It could be your point of sale. It could be, if you're in telco, it could be media control in terms of IPTV, etc., etc. And the trigger points are almost the same touch points, but after the data has been processed. So when you start looking at, and this is a very marketing term, but omni-channel tracking, when you look at analysis, when you look at third-party data. So the interesting thing is that you have to make more and more sense of vast quantities of data that organizations are gathering, analyzing, and storing. And this is why companies have to turn to data management solutions and platforms to help them manage this growing and more complex demand for data itself. And when you look at Talend as a data management platform, Talend is a unified platform that effectively provides all of the connections, all of the internal processes and data management requirements that you would require in a modern data management platform. And again, you have to, when you talk to your customers, you have to look at this not as a functional tool, but as a strategic platform. And it has to be positioned as a strategic platform. Customers are not really out to acquire more products. What they tend to want to do is to be able to consolidate. And a data management platform should enable most of your customers to be able to achieve that. And then when we look at the components, as I've said before, it really is around access to the data. You have to, once you access the data, you've got to look at data quality. You've got to be in a position where if data quality is bad, you can fix the data quality issues through certain data quality rules. You can apply machine learning to automate that. You may even want to reference external data sources to validate and to govern the data types that you have. And for a lot of organizations, once you have data, you can start to master that data, you can define, you can unify, and you can manage that data in a centralized hub. And then particularly when you're looking at unstructured data, then the whole concept of data streaming, whether it's real-time or near real-time, suddenly becomes very important. Because when you're streaming data, quite often the business decision process becomes real-time and near real-time. So a modern data management platform will give you both the ETL, ELT requirements, and it should all be done in a single unified platform. And I'm going to stop there because I think we're sort of running out of time. I was going to go through Talend. I think you can Google Talend, you can search Talend at any time you want to. But fundamentally, Talend is one of the few unified data management platforms. And Talend will give your customers, your prospects, pretty much everything that they need out of the box to provide either a data management platform to manage their current environment. It could be that they want to migrate to cloud, and it might be that they want to run more web services because data is becoming more strategic to them. And I really wanted just an opportunity to see if there's any questions so far.
Absolutely agreed, Brian. So, guys, I believe there are no further questions. So we'll quickly just wrap this up. Thank you so much, Brian, for your valuable time. And on behalf of everybody, on behalf of Talend and Redington, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today in this first session, in this series of sessions where we'll take you through data management concepts and how Talend helps you achieve your data goals. So as Redington, we are the largest IT distributors in Middle East and Africa. And we've partnered with Talend as their value-added distributors in MEA region. And together we look forward to grow business. So Redington's role is to make more and more business and IT users aware of Talend's data management capabilities and work together with partners and resellers to deliver more value. With that, I would like to wrap up this session, and I look forward to meeting all you guys in the next session that's planned the next week. I'm sure all of you already have the registration links with you. So we look forward to meeting you then. Thank you so much all. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, thank